Hi, I'm Gaurav Gupta. It's a rapidly evolving world, and things are changing faster than they have in the past. Uncertainty is going up, complexity is going up. And so one of the things that's evolved about the 8 steps is rather than a linear approach, it's a much more iterative approach to leading change. And so John even talks about these as the 8 accelerators because it is now accelerating change. It is about ensuring that your change is happening at the pace that it needs to happen, and you're not following a linear process but are being more iterative.
I'm John Kotter. This comes from a research effort that's been going on for decades and is increasingly, at least given the evidence I have, important in a rapidly changing, volatile, chaotic world.
And I'm Vanessa Akhtar, and as Gaurav said, these 8 steps have evolved over time. The other key element of that evolution is really grounding them in a sense of opportunity. So you can build a sense of urgency, get many more people involved, build buy-in, remove barriers, really find ways to help embed the change in the way that you do work, all in service of that big opportunity.
Are we ready for this webinar? So just a few housekeeping pieces. All audio lines have been muted, so we should be good to focus on this stuff. The webinar is going to run until 1 p.m. Eastern time, whatever that converts to in your part of the world. I can see a whole list of people joining us from all over, so various time zones in there. If you've got any questions during the presentation, I'll be monitoring the Q&A box, and we'll be finding some opportunities for Gaurav to get some questions and respond to some stuff as we go through. But be sure to join in the conversation and prompts from him as we go through when he asks you to think about stuff, respond to things, etc. And I've used his name several times, but I should probably give a little quick introduction. So Gaurav Gupta is Managing Director and Head of R&D at Kotter, with global business experience translating strategy into successful implementation for clients in a number of diverse industries. He's the co-author of the book Change. I'm sure it's the original name title there for that book, but we all know change is always changing. And that details how leaders can actually leverage challenges and opportunities to make a sustainable workplace change in a rapidly accelerating world. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Gaurav. Thank you very much.
Super, thanks, Rich, and really excited to be here. Looking forward to this. And as Rich said, please do, if you have questions as we go through, please do pop them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. All right, so wanted to start off maybe with just something that's maybe a little fun. So I'd like you to, for a moment, just picture a world map, and I just had one on the screen there. So whether it was the one that was up on the screen or something you've seen recently, and I'd like you to picture the map, and I'm going to ask you a question, and we're going to try to use the react buttons here. So if you think the statement I make is true, please use the clapping hands react button, and if you think the statement I make is false, please use the thumbs up button, and we'll see how well this works. So the statement is, so Greenland, right? So off of the coast of sort of Canada and in the North Atlantic, the statement is that Greenland is larger than Algeria. So Algeria, country in Northern Africa. All right. So if you think that statement is true, let's see some. There we go. We see them coming in. All right. Okay, we've got quite a few of both. So some people think it's larger, and some people think it's maybe not. So let me ask you the same question now. What if I showed you this map and I asked you the same question, and I said, is Greenland larger? Right, so that's Greenland up there, and then Algeria sort of occupying probably about a third of what looks like the desert in the north of Africa. Very different, right? This probably looks a bit weird. You're probably looking at this going, oh gosh, the aspect ratio is off. What's happening with this map? Nothing's really wrong with this map. It's called the Gale-Peters map. It was actually designed to show the accurate size of the land masses on the globe, right? Because you're taking a globe and you're trying to project it from 3 dimensions into 2 dimensions. There's really no good way to do it. There's various different ways to do it, and this is one of them. This next one is probably what you're more familiar with, right? Most of us have seen this. This is the Mercator projection, first developed by a Flemish cartographer in the 1600s, and then adopted as the standard in the 1800s, right? And if you look at this, I mean, Greenland's larger than all of Africa. So of course, if you were looking at this map and I asked you the question about whether Greenland's larger than Algeria, you would probably say yes. Yeah. Now, some of you have probably seen these maps. Some of you probably have some experience with this. But why did I want to start with this? Because when it comes to change, a lot of how we respond to change is based on the experiences that we have, right? It's based on the knowledge that we have. It's based on what we believe to be true. It's based on the assumptions that we might have made. And if you're talking to somebody who is looking at this Mercator projection map, and you've always looked at the Gale Peters map, and you're trying to get them to get on board with your point of view that Greenland is actually smaller than Algeria, which, by the way, it is, if you're wondering. If you're trying to get them on board with the idea that Greenland is smaller than Algeria, but that is their perspective, it's going to be very difficult, right? It's going to be really hard for you to convince them to get on board with what you have in mind. And so part of change and part of us being able to successfully lead change is helping people to change their perspective, is helping people to understand new information, new data, new context, new situations, and new perspectives. So just wanted to start with something as a bit of a thought starter. And what I wanted to do for the rest of the time today is really talk about three key focus areas. So the first, we're going to talk about the context. So what's happening in the world around us? What's different today than 10 years ago or 20 years ago? And what implications does that have for how we lead change in organizations? Then we're going to talk a little bit about the science of change and how that's evolved over the last decade or so. And how that science of change informs the approaches that help us be more effective in leading change. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about some of the approaches and tactics and sort of the methodology and how that links with the ACMP standards, as well as sort of what we see as being effective in driving change. So that's kind of the three key areas that we're going to cover. So maybe before I get to that, just another little question for you. In outer space, which direction is up? There isn't one, right? Because north being up is a convention. Nothing wrong with this map either. Although every time I look at this, it feels wrong, but nothing wrong with this, right? I know, Rich, you said you're going to New Zealand. If a New Zealander was sort of developing the first map of the globe, it might look something like this. Okay, so moving on to the context. You know, I think it was probably about 3 months ago, and I came across this quote from the chief economist of the Bank of America. And he said, the fault was relying too much on history and too much on our models. And this was in relation to how the economy reacted to the change in interest rates, right? And reflecting on this, the question it raises for me is this just about this one situation? Or are we in an environment where actually historical models aren't as predictive as we thought they were, right? Are we in a situation where historical models are starting to be less and less useful because of what's happening around us and because of how fast things are changing? And if you look at some of the data behind this, so, you know, the first number there, 90%, that says that in the last 2 years, so in actually it's 2022 and 2023 is when the study was done. In 2022 and 2023, those 2 years, we have created 90% of all data that exists in the world today. So think about that for a moment. We've created 9 times more data in 2 years than in all of human civilization, right? That's astounding. The second number here, 74x, from 2010 to 2023, that is how much more data is being created per day. We're creating 74 times more data in the last 10 years, right? Which is crazy. Now, every time I sort of talk about this, somebody points out, yes, but a lot of that data is just, you know, people's Instagram reels and cat videos on Facebook. And that's probably true, right? I'm not suggesting that it's 74 times more important data, but it is still a lot more information for us to deal with. And the implication of having so much more information to deal with is that it creates uncertainty. So if you look at this data, which is from the IMF, and it's charting uncertainty in the world, what you see is there's these spikes, which, by the way, correspond to sort of big events, right? Big global events, the last one being the pandemic. But the more interesting thing for me is actually the trend. So right around the millennia, you start to see this trend of uncertainty going up, right? You start to see greater uncertainty accelerating from sort of right around the year 2000. And if you think about this in the context of change and certainly the leading change work that Dr. John Kotter first started and we continue to do at the firm, leading change came out in 1996, right? So 1996 was a very different era. We had started to see the increase in the pace of change around us. We started to see some of the greater complexity in change, but we hadn't seen this level of uncertainty that we have now. And that's something we need to deal with when we think about how we lead change effectively. And it isn't just uncertainty, right? Because uncertainty is sort of a little bit of, you could think of it as the fact that things may change in the future, right? That's sort of what uncertainty is in a way. But change itself is getting faster as well. And there's lots of different data that you could look at. You could look at how many years companies spend on the S&P 500. You might have seen some version of this. This is how long it takes certain technologies to reach 50 million users. And you can see this really starting to accelerate in terms of how fast things are disseminating around us. That's another way to look at it is sort of just the calculation capability of supercomputers. And it is astounding. It is continuing to be exponential, right? I mean, you look at exponential curves and you think at some point it's gonna slow. It isn't, right? It's continuing to be exponential, which, by the way, is part of why we can create all of that data that we were talking about earlier, right? We can create so much more data now. And the problem that all of this leads to, this context leads to, is the internal ability of organizations and teams and individuals to change is far, far outstripped by the external need for change in this moment, right? Things are changing around us much faster than our ability to change as an organization. And I think there's a very famous quote, I think it's Jack Welch, who said, if the external pace of change is faster than the internal pace of change, then you're doomed. And that's a little bit of the environment we're in, right? We've got to find better ways to change internally. We've got to find better ways to help our teams and our organizations deal with change, lead change, and navigate change effectively, because nothing suggests that this pace of change is slowing down, right? If you look at that uncertainty graph, nothing suggests that uncertainty is gonna come back to a more manageable level. And so we've got to find better ways to lead change. We don't know what these changes are going to be in the future, right? It's the game of predicting the future is always a losing game. I mean, if even Back to the Future, which, by the way, I think did a really good job of predicting the future, but if Back to the Future was correct, we'd all be in flying cars at this point, right? So we are not good at predicting the future. But what we do know is that change will happen, and change will continue to happen faster, because that's what the trend shows. And we're going to continue to be in this more complex, more uncertain, faster moving, more disruptive environment, right? So that all brings us to, so what does that mean? What can we do? How do we develop these better ways to lead change in organizations? And so that's a lot of what we've been studying over the last decade or so, is to say, how does the leading change framework need to change, and what do we know from the science that helps us determine where those changes might lie? And so I want to touch on briefly just a little bit of some of the science behind the approach, because when John first did the research, it was entirely observational, right? It was he studied hundreds of companies, hundreds of organizations going through large change, and then looked for the patterns of what works and what doesn't work. It was not to try to understand why, right? His research was to understand what works, not to understand why it works. And so a lot of what we've been doing is actually trying to understand why it works, so that we know where we might need to make some changes to the models and the frameworks. And so there's three streams of research that we really sort of dove into on this. The first one is brain science and neuroscience, and how that has evolved, because the sort of advancements in that have been phenomenal in the last few years and have given us a lot more insight into how human beings respond to change. So that's what the first stream of research was. The second one was then understanding organizational systems and organizations themselves, and how they respond to change. And then the third one was continuation of the research that John started at Harvard Business School, which was observational, to understand how organizations are dealing with change. So I'm just going to touch on each of these very quickly. The first one, which is this sort of behavioral science, brain science research, and it's sort of the sense that human beings are resistant to change, right? That naturally we resist change. And I think that's it's partly true, but it's not entirely true. I mean, if you think about your personal lives or your professional lives, there are certain changes you run towards, right? And so the question we were trying to answer is, what's the difference? Why are some changes things we fear and other changes things we embrace, right? Why is it that some changes we resist and some changes we really adopt? And when you start to understand how the brain body works behind this, there are really two systems operating within our bodies at any time. The first one is the one that's probably more familiar to people, right? It's the survive system. It's the fight or flight response. So you see a threat, that used to be a physical threat, a predator in the bush sort of thing. But that same mechanism in the body has now been co-opted for threats that are not just physical threats, but are threats to our ego, threats to our status, threats to our positioning, all of that, right? And what happens when you see a threat or you perceive a threat is it's an autonomous reaction. The sympathetic nervous system kicks into gear. You've got chemicals that start coursing through the body, things like adrenaline, which can be very helpful, right? Because it really narrows our focus, increases our energy, and allows us to deal with the threat. And it literally narrows our focus, right? Your peripheral vision, when you're in a state of sort of heightened survival, the survive channel activation, your peripheral vision goes away, and you're very narrowly focused on the problem in front of you. Very effective if you're trying to solve a problem you know how to solve, right? If you're trying to solve a problem you know how to solve, the survive channel is fantastic. If you're trying to solve a problem and you don't know how to solve, or you're trying to solve a problem that is highly complex and requires collaboration and requires involving other people, the survive channel is terrible. And what's worse, the survive channel actually clamps down some of the things that you need to be able to solve those sorts of problems, right? So the good news is that there is another channel, which is the thrive channel. And the thrive channel, similar to the survive channel, is autonomous. It is triggered by not threats, but opportunities. It is triggered by something new, something that you're curious about, something that you see that's energizing, that's you see an opportunity in it. It's the parasympathetic nervous system that kicks into gear. Again, chemicals being released, different chemicals, and the sorts of behavior that it starts to elicit is innovation and collaboration. It's the sorts of behaviors that allow us to actually seek out new things and do new things, right? And so if you're in a change environment where what's required is doing more of the same, but with more intensity, survive channel works great, right? A burning platform is fantastic if you want to get people to move quickly, right? But if you're trying to get people to do something new and different and innovative and something that's going to take a couple of years, the burning platform doesn't work, right? The burning platform just creates more stress. It just creates, because if you can't resolve the threats, that's when you end up with cortisol. That's when you end up with being overwhelmed, and the fight or flight becomes a freeze response and you do nothing, right? So if you're trying to create change that's going to take a little while, that's going to need a lot of collaboration, a lot of engagement from people, even if there's a threat that motivates it, you have to start to be able to flip that into an opportunity. You have to be able to get people to understand what will be better when we get there, right? Why is it, what will we be able to do that we can't do now? Because once people start to get connected to the opportunity, that's when you can start to create longer lasting, sustainable change. So that was sort of the learning from the brain science and the behavioral science, which really, if I were to sort of boil it down to one thing, it is how do we help create opportunity-focused change, not threat-focused change, right? That's the key learning. The second piece is around organizational science. And if you think about where our organizational systems come from, right? So imagine for a moment, get in a time machine and travel back to before the industrial age. And imagine you're a cobbler, right? What does your organization look like? What does your business look like as a cobbler, right? You're doing everything. You're procuring the materials, you're making the shoes, you're advertising, you're collecting the finances, all of that. If you're extremely successful or you're in a big town, you might have 2 or 3 people who are working as your apprentices. And that's pretty much it, right? That was the form of the organization. Other than the King's Army or the church, that was the only form of organizations we had, were these small groups, right? Now you fast forward through the industrial age. Think about Nike, right? Tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of employees all across the globe, trying to make shoes in Vietnam and Peru that are exactly the same, trying to make shoes on a Monday or a Friday that are the same, highly specialized, right? Not only do you have, functions like finance and HR, but even the production process is highly specialized. And that creates complexity. That creates a lot of complexity in an organization. Imagine trying to manage a 100,000 person organization with the same systems that you were managing a 4-person organization. It doesn't work. And so a lot of what we have today as systems, things like the hierarchy. I mean, the first org chart that looked like the one that's on the screen that everybody recognizes immediately is actually not that old. It's only about 100 years old. And so all of these systems and structures came about through the industrial age, where the main need was to create reliability, repeatability, and consistency, right? The main need at the time was consistency and reliability in how organizations operated. And that has been great. That has been what's led to sort of the living standards that we have today, the sort of mass production that has enabled a lot of that. The challenge is in the context that we talked about earlier, where things are changing faster, where there's greater uncertainty. In addition to reliability and consistency, you also need agility. You also need adaptability. You need to be able to move fast. And our systems and structures are not designed to do that, right? Our systems and structures are designed. I mean, if you imagine this is an age when most people weren't even literate. And so the idea of a few people making all the decisions and then everybody else carrying out the orders and executing, that's what we had. That doesn't work today. That doesn't work in a rapidly changing environment. You've got to be able to find new ways to create agility and adaptability. And that's what's the second piece on that sort of in that green box, is this idea of a network, right? Is this idea of, yes, you've got a hierarchy that drives reliability and consistency, but you've also got a network that helps to create greater connection and helps to create agility in organizations. So that's sort of the second piece of research, which is around organizational structures. And then the last thing, or the last sort of stream of research, is really the observational research and the continuation of John's work around what does work when you're leading large-scale transformations. And we'll talk a little bit more about the approach, but there's really 2 parts to it. There's the accelerators, the 8 accelerators, which many of you might know as the 8 steps, and there's a reason why we don't talk about them as steps anymore, because of what we said in the video, right? It's not linear anymore. It needs to be iterative, because things it's too quick for us to be able to take a linear process through this. And also there's multiple changes happening at any given time. You don't have the luxury to focus on one thing and drive it through. And then the second part of it are these change principles, which really are about doing 2 things that could feel that as if they're in conflict, but they're not, and doing both of them at the same time. So, management and leadership, right, as defined as behavior. So change management is about making sure we have the right plans, making sure we have identified the right people, making sure we have a budget and a process, and we know how we're going to manage through the work that needs to happen. And that's great, and we need that. And we also need change leadership, right? Change leadership is about helping inspire and motivate people to do things differently, creating commitment for the change, not just passive support, but actual active commitment. And that requires leadership. And you need both of those things to be successful. Head and heart, you've got to be able to communicate in a way that people can understand rationally the reasons for the change, but also can emotionally connect to it, right? It's got to be emotionally compelling as well. You're not going to be successful if you just have a business case that is entirely based on numbers, right? Somehow people need to feel that this is going to be better, and here's how it's going to be better. So you've got to have both of those. Have to and want to. There's things we have to do. I mean, organizations have, roles and job descriptions, and there are things that all of us have to do in our jobs. And then there are things that we want to do, right? And the more you can activate that want to, the more people can lead from passion, the more successful the change effort's going to be. And then select few and diverse many. Some things are better done in small groups, right? There are certain things where you need specialization, you need certain skill sets. It makes sense to do them in small groups. However, we often over-index on that. and don't tap into the diverse many, because there are many other things where actually getting lots of people involved. So, you've got 2% effort from 100 people rather than 100% effort from 2 people can be far more effective. And so again, leveraging both of those, right? The select few and the diverse many. So that's a little bit of the science. And then what maybe just to sort of put a point on this is, if you look at what's happening from the environment around us, the context, and you look at what we know now from the science that we didn't know, 20 years ago, it points to a few things that need to be different about how we think about change, right? The first one is change isn't episodic, right? The time of, hey, we once every 3 years, we do something big, right? Once every 3 years or 5 years, we restructure the organization, or we, acquire some new big business. That's not how it works anymore. Now that's happening every year, right? Every year we're doing something big. And so change has gone from being an episodic event to something that is really, really continuous. And that means we have to think about it not as we still have to do big scale change, transformation, absolutely. But we also have to supplement that with ongoing pivots, right? Ongoing, immediate, quick reaction to what's happening externally, to what's happening in the market. So we need to be able to do continuous change as well as episodic. We already talked about sort of the move from linear to iterative. With the amount of change happening around us, you've got to be doing 7 things at once. And if you're doing 7 things at once, it has to be an iterative approach, because you learn as you go. We got to tap into more leadership from more people. Change cannot be driven by a few people in an organization. That's been, true most of the time, but it's getting even more true today. John's talked about the idea of wins for a long time as a, you can't wait 2 years to see impact and expect people to put effort in for 2 years and then see the impact from it, right? You've got to create wins along the way so that people can see that there's some success here, and we're demonstrating that. And that's still true. But in some ways, the need for it is accelerated and amplified, because what might have stood out from the noise as a win a few years ago doesn't even register anymore, because there's so much happening all the time. And so you need greater amplitude and greater magnitude of these wins. We talked about sort of this shift from a threat-centric to an opportunity-centric. I mean, the burning platform, still great if you want to motivate immediate action, but not great if you're trying to create innovation and you're trying to create change that lasts. And then finally, this idea of, we've talked about driving change, and I think what driving change implies is leaders pushing change through an organization. And that's sort of increasingly more difficult to do. And I think we've got to start to think about it more as encouraging change, right? How do you, as leaders in an organization, encourage that pull from people saying, look, I understand why we're doing this. I understand what the benefits are going to be. How can I help, right? How can I join? How can I help make this be a success? And so that's just some of the things that, as we think about what needs to change from an approach standpoint, these 6 things are really influencing how we start to approach the tactics and the approaches. So I'm going to switch to that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the tactics and approaches now. And the first thing I wanted to do is just maybe go back to the accelerators for a moment, and also just sort of help people see where the ACMP standards sort of align with this approach. And so, the first part of the accelerator approach is really 2 things. It used to be, by the way, the big opportunity was not part of the original 8 steps. The big opportunity is in reaction to the recognition that we've got to help people be able to articulate that opportunity. And most times people don't do that, right? There's a business case for change and we get going. And we go, all right, let's start implementing. And we don't take the time to say, why are we doing this? What's the rationale that, again, not just intellectual, but emotional rationale for why we're doing this right now, right? And not just why are we doing it, but why are we doing it right now? And why is it a priority right now? So there's sort of the effort around that, which ties into this idea of what's the organizational readiness to be able to actually make the changes that are necessary, right? And how do you create that sense of urgency and commitment to the change early on? And from all of our research, majority of the times people don't do enough to create that level of commitment for the change, right? And you get to the point where people might go, hey, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah, we should do that. But that's very different than that's a good idea. How can I help make it happen? Right? That's commitment. And that's what we need to be able to create, and that sense of urgency around change. Then, building a guiding coalition, forming a strategic vision, enlisting a volunteer army, all of this is about getting the right plan in place, getting the right strategy in place for how we're going to create that pull that we talked about earlier in the organization. Who are the stakeholders? Who needs to be involved? How do we think more expansively about that? So the diverse many is a key component of that. And so that's really getting our strategy and our plan right. And then enabling action by removing roadblocks, generating short-term wins. That's the execution work, right? Now we're starting to really make change happen. We're starting to implement. We're starting to see results. We're starting to demonstrate success, and it actually helps us to the point of iterative. It helps us get more people engaged. It helps us create, clearer vision of where we're going. And so that's the execution piece. And then finally, accelerating and sustaining. And that's a little bit of how do you scale, right? So most times you go through a change effort and you realize actually there's other ways that we can scale what we've just done and create bigger impact in the organization. So how do we make sure we're doing that? And then of course instituting it so that it sustains and we don't move back to what we had been doing. So that's a little bit of sort of how the accelerators play out and where they map against some of the ACMP standards. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to do before we flip over to some questions, looking at the time, I think we've got a good amount of time for questions. That's great. So before we flip over to some questions, I just want to talk a little bit about some more tangible tactics. So as you're thinking about leading change in organizations, what are some of the tactics that you can start to employ? So the first one, which we sort of touched on, is this idea of acknowledging the threats in the environment, but then reframing them as opportunities, right? So an example of that might be, look, we're taking a defensive stance against, I don't know, a competitor launching a new product, right? That starts from a threat because we can see our market share decreasing if the competitor's product's doing better than ours. And I'm certainly not suggesting we don't acknowledge that, right? We have to make sure people understand the threat. We have to make sure people move away from a complacency and a mindset of, what we're doing now is good enough. And actually, the threat is really good at doing that, right? A threat is really good at getting us to, excuse me, to bust through the complacency. But then at some point, you've got to take that and reframe it and say, okay, and when we do that, when we deal with this threat, what is it going to look like? What's going to be better? Why are we as an organization going to be better for having dealt with that threat, right? And that's the opportunity. That's the opportunity that you're reframing for people so that they go, yes, let's focus on dealing with this threat. And I can see why we need to continue to accelerate our change and achieve what we can through this opportunity. Very tactical ways to do that with leadership teams is to actually sit down and say, okay, let's list out what are the threats, to our organization. Great. Now let's talk about what the flip side, right? Let's figure out what the list of opportunities are in this. That's the first tactic. The second one is just celebrating progress along the way. I mean, to my point earlier about wins needing to be, cut above the noise in the organization. One way to do that is to make sure we're putting effort into celebrating them. We're putting effort into communicating them. And wins can come in various different forms, right? Wins can be interim results. Wins can also be milestones, right? Progress against milestones and how we communicate that, or engagement from people and how we communicate that. So really amplifying the communication and celebration of progress along the way to help fuel that sort of momentum and movement from broad parts of the organization. So that's sort of tactic 2. The third one is this idea of delegating, right? So there's maybe 2 parts to this. One is the more people are involved early on, the more they're going to feel part of the change, right? So I sort of jokingly call this the IKEA effect, right? So anybody who's actually built IKEA furniture, the invested labor in building that furniture inflates the value to you, right? I still have, I'm looking over there because I still have an IKEA chair that I probably have had for 20 years and it's starting to fall apart, but I'm not going to let it go because there's a little bit of this, well, it's the thing I put some effort into, right? And that's true of lots of things. I mean, there's a research study where I think it was mugs. I think the college campus, and they gave a group of students mugs, and they said, okay, you've now had this mug, and you've had a cup of coffee out of this mug. How much would you sell it for? Right? And I don't know, students say $20 on average, right? And then you go ask another group of students at the same college, hey, how much would you pay for that mug over there? And they go $10, right? So the fact that you've had it for an hour, or you've drank a coffee out of it, is enough to inflate the value in your mind, because now it's yours, right? So how do you make things, how do you get people to feel like the change is theirs? By getting them involved. And it may not be getting them involved in the decisions to change, or in the decisions of exactly what's going to happen. It could be something as simple as getting them involved in how certain things happen, right? We worked with a organization that they were actually shutting down some factories, so pretty significant change for individuals. And they involved the people in the factories in determining, look, where's the volume going to move? How is it going to happen? What criteria are we going to use for determining, who gets moved out first? And the level of sort of transparency in the process made people feel much more connected to the change, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that means people feel, good about the fact that the factory is shutting down, but it changes the conversation quite significantly. So involving people more, being able to delegate some of that control out from a small core group starts to create this IKEA effect, where people start to feel like it's their change. It's not somebody else's change, right? So that's sort of the third tactic, if I'm counting correctly. And then the last one I want to talk about is reducing the noise. I've mentioned this a couple of times, that there's so much noise in organizations right now. How do you reduce that, right? What are the so if I think about it in the context of a change that we might be implementing, it can be seductive to start to measure 20 different things, right? To start to go, oh, well, I want to know what's happening over there, and what's the adoption metric there, and what's the change impact over there. And that's okay if we need the data to make decisions, but often we're just collecting metrics because we can. And what happens when you look at a dashboard that has 20 metrics and 19 of them are green and one of them is red, right? You focus on the red. If you focus on the red, survive response goes up. You ignore the 19. Forget the fact that 19 things are happening that are great. You just focus on that one thing, right? I tell this story often, but I remember working with someone who had a 19 and 20 are actually the numbers, a $20 million target for savings in an area, and they delivered 19, and it wasn't good, right? No one walked away going, hey, that's great, we delivered 19. People walked away going, we didn't deliver the 20. There's this focus on what we miss, because we feel lost so much more, right? We feel lost a lot more as human beings. And so, back to the metrics, what are the ones that you actually need? Because if there's only 3 metrics that are helping us make decisions, let's only look at those 3. If there's only 20 people who, not everything needs to be diverse many. If there's only 20 people who are actually involved with, impacted by, necessary for a particular change, let's restrict it to that. You don't need to have everybody involved with everything. If you don't need 30 people to attend a meeting, let's not have 30 people attend a meeting, right? So how do we reduce the noise so that the important things can actually cut through and get to people? Because we are all bombarded with so much right now, right? We're all facing, the information overload from earlier, right? 74 times more information. We're facing that all the time. And so taking a deliberate approach to what can I remove? What can I take away? What do I not need? And then focusing on only the things that are really critical. So that's sort of the last tactic I was going to talk about. And then maybe just the one other thing, a couple of minutes on before we go to questions, is where the research is going next. And a lot of the research that we have done so far is focused on this idea of how do you take a change transformation effort and lead it successfully, right? And that's great. That's a lot of the episodic research. That's a lot episodic change. That's a lot about how do we, deal with change in organizations. To the point I made earlier about episodic and continuous, we're also now dealing with continuous change. And so the premium that places on organizations to be adaptable and to be able to deal with change on a more regular basis and an almost consistent, almost sort of continuous basis, that ability is becoming so important. And so our research now is really focused on how do you create adaptability in an organization as a competitive advantage, right? And there's sort of three areas we're looking into. One is we talked about the structures and systems earlier. Most of the systems we have today aren't very change friendly, right? So as an example, strategic planning. How do we do strategic planning process? Well, we do a lot of work. We do a lot of market research. We understand what the current state looks like, and then we develop a 5-year plan. I mean, imagine your 5-year plan before the pandemic, if you were a manufacturer, right? I mean, and so 5-year plans, this idea that we can develop formulate a strategy and then just execute it for a while, it doesn't really work very well today, right? So how do we start to adapt our systems like a strategic planning process, right? How do you change that to be more change friendly? How do you use, things like scenario planning? How do you more explicitly articulate your assumptions so that when the assumptions change, you know what changes to make and you're not always playing catch up? So that's sort of one area of it. The other is sort of culture and what does an adaptive culture actually look like and what are the key elements of it? And this research goes back all the way to the late 80s. And there's strong evidence that suggests that organizations that have this adaptive culture continue to outperform those that don't. And then the final piece is, there is something about change capacity, right? And hence this idea of, I mean, for this group, clearly very relevant, but that the capability that individuals need to have in an organization, right? The capability that, and yes, there's much deeper expertise that certain individuals need, and then there's maybe not quite as much, but still capability that everyone in an organization needs to be able to deal with and lead change more effectively. And so that's kind of where our research is going next, and we'll have more to share about that as we move forward. But that was about all I wanted to share. I know I've spoken a little bit fast. I was trying to get through some of this to make sure we had some time for questions, because I love to hear what questions people have and be able to respond to them. So I'll stop, and Rich, if you can help with the Q&A, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem at all on that. Yeah, lots and lots of questions, comments, pieces. I'll try and use my best synergizing toolkit to try and bring some of these things together as we go through. But start off actually, quite a few comments and the questions focusing around this idea of, people either survive or thrive. And this indication, and somebody was saying, like, how do we actually move people from the survival mode into the thrive mode? What sort of things can we look at that? And a couple of other comments about, well, what if these are particularly, cultures that are distrusting, or there's maybe a bit, of a challenge that people are feeling pushed down upon, that they're only going to be, stuck in the survive mode. They're never going to be able to see beyond that mode, etc. So just wonder if you could put some thoughts on that, and
Sure.
any thoughts and tactics you can share on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think getting people to activate their thrive is really about helping them see the opportunity. That's a lot of what it is. And then there is, how do you mitigate survive, right? How do you reduce because in most organizations, our experience is the survive channel is overactive and the thrive channel is underactive, right? And I don't want to, by the way, imply that you want to get rid of survive, right? Survive is very effective, and it's a question of how do you get both the survive and the thrive channels active in the right range, right? You're not overheated on either one. And so mitigating survive, a lot of that is, where can you provide, because it is so uncertain, where can you provide some certainty? What can you help people understand better, right? So I don't think I've ever talked to a leader who wouldn't agree with the fact that transparency is good. And most of the time we don't share things transparently. And we don't share things transparently because we're worried, right? We go, well, if we share this and we don't have all the answers, it's going to create greater anxiety. Well, you know what? People will fill in their answers anyway. And in general, we're pretty good at filling in answers that are worse than the reality. And so sharing more transparently what's happening, what you know, what you don't know, right? Being willing to say, look, this is what we know. We know these 3 things, and that's what we're going to do. These 3 we don't know, and we'll figure it out, right? We have the confidence that we can figure it out. So I think that sort of level of transparency, predictability in how you behave helps mitigate survive. So if you're consistent in the way you respond to things, you're consistent in the way you respond to criticism as well as changes, that's going to help mitigate that survive. And then amplifying thrive is about opportunity and talking more about the opportunity and talking more about what can we do that we couldn't do before and relying on others to do that. So not feeling like it's only the leaders of the change effort who need to do it, but actually getting other people to start to do that as well. So that's a little bit of sort of the moving from survive to thrive, or maybe not so much moving, but activating thrive more and mitigating survive. The other thing, maybe I'd say is the sense of change fatigue, because there's so much happening and people feeling burnt out. We get fatigued when we're doing things that we feel like we have to do, not things we feel like we want to do in any way. And so again, being able to help people understand the benefits in a way that helps them feel like it's something they want to participate in, creating opportunities for them to participate in small ways, right? It doesn't have to be everyone's part of everything, but in small ways, can again help to move it more into that thrive, and that can help with the burnout and the fatigue as well.
Yeah, I think there's a few comments that were made just in the journal piece about people experiencing this, how much is too much almost with that sort of burnout piece and things like that as well. But one of the areas I wanted to pick up on, because we've got a few questions overlapping on this, you mentioned about like the adaptability through a network structure and things like that. And but a few folks were curious about more information on that and how leadership would work within that space as well. And that sort of, network piece without what does it look like in that piece. So a few overlapping pieces on that stuff. So maybe you can share a bit more about how that operates in terms of moving forward. And again, like with any of this stuff, if there's external references or things like that that you want to share as well, then by all means do so.
Sure. So on the idea of the network, I mean, essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a mechanism where you don't have to rely on information flowing up in the hierarchy and then back down in the hierarchy. You don't have to rely on, look, I've got a good idea, but my idea requires, collaboration from, I don't know, finance. And the only way I can get collaboration from finance is to go to my boss, who goes to his or her boss, who goes to his or her boss. You get to the common point of contact, and then you sort of, assign somebody, right? So we're trying to create mechanisms where you can start to do things like say, look, I'm seeing this opportunity in this particular market. I'm going to get, I'm going to reach out to 3 or 4 people. We're going to figure it out and we're going to move on it, right? So, it's obviously much easier said than done, because there's cultural elements to that you have to get right. There are structural elements to that you have to get right. Maybe the main point for me though is it is not a replacement for the hierarchy as it currently exists, right? I think a lot of, well, not a lot, but there've definitely been efforts at things like self-managed teams and things where it is a bit of a replacement. And at least our point of view on this is that doesn't work, because in order to create the reliability and consistency that you need, if you rely entirely on the sort of network to do that, the network starts to actually mirror some of the structures of the hierarchy. And so you still need to have the hierarchy focusing on the reliability and consistency and driving that part. But it's almost like it's the discretionary 10% where people are actually feeling empowered enough to be able to say, I see that as an opportunity and I'm going to go after it. And they have the skill sets. That's the other part, right? They've got to have the skill sets to be able to both identify opportunities, understand how they connect to the overall organizational priorities. So leadership does have to provide some guardrails, right? Because otherwise you end up with chaos where everyone's doing, 20 different things and they may not be moving in the same direction. So there's a role for leadership to play in that. There's a role for the hierarchy to play in setting those guardrails, and then creating the culture and the sense of empowerment where people can go, yeah, I'm going to start to create these networks. And they're not, and the network isn't, the idea isn't to have some formal structure in place where, Gaurav and Rich and, these other 3 people are in this pod and they can, work with them. It's to say, encourage people to look, if I need help from somebody, I have a system that tells me who, so I have a way to know who to reach out to. And then 2, it's an expectation that people will jump in and help on things, right? So that's a little bit of sort of how you start to create that. It's probably more of a cultural, behavioral leadership challenge than it is a structural challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, picking up on that leadership piece, there's a few comments that were made here as well in terms of, you mentioned like, the delegating activities and taking on that, to make people feel part of the change in terms of that stuff. But the question is like, how do you actually make sure this what you've delegated gets done? What sort of, because it's great to sort of pass it, and get people involved in this, but a couple of questions on that in terms of, that piece coming in as well. And any
Yeah.
thoughts, ideas, monitoring, measuring, whatever it may be.
Yeah. I think there's a few things to it, right? One is what you said, monitoring, right? There's got to be some way of knowing what progress we're making and are we making the progress that we need and that sort of thing. The other is, you don't want to be delegating to people who don't want to delegate it to them, right? So you've got to be able to create back to that sort of want to thing. There's got to be a bit of volunteerism to change because change is often outside of my day job, right? Or at least the change we're talking about. And if it's outside of my day job, then I'm only going to really prioritize it if I feel passionately about it and if I feel excited about it. So delegation isn't to say, let's take this, task that, nobody really wants to do and just go and say, hey, Rich, can you do this? Because I'm delegating it to you. It's more about ensuring that there's enough people in the organization who understand the priority so that, folks are raising their hands and saying, look, I know I see how in my area this connects to the overall change. I would love to participate in this. And then you go, okay, well, here's a way that you could help, right? So it's creating that pull before you delegate or as you delegate, rather than trying to push stuff down, which generally doesn't work very well.
Yeah, yeah. No, I totally get that with all of that piece as well. And I think interesting, a couple of questions sort of going a little bit sideways from the leadership piece, but still relevant to that, is how do you get leaders who are responsible for change or whatever their role may be with the change to be willing to recognize a threat or a challenge point when they need to turn that into the opportunities you say, but they may not have a culture that encourages that naming threats, etc. So any sort of thoughts on different ways of positioning or different ways of approaching that for folks?
Sorry, can you say the last part? You said they may not have a way to.
They may currently have a culture that's not necessarily encouraging people to name, potentially threat equals potential failure. That sort of, at least, no, we don't talk about those things here. How can we actually address that challenge of having to
Yeah.
move that?
So I mean, that's a huge challenge, right? And
Yeah.
you can't solve there's a cultural component to that which you can't solve easily. What you can do to help yourself, though, in that environment is being really clear about the assumptions you're making and what you're doing, so that when you need to change them, it doesn't feel like, oh, we were wrong, but it feels like, hey, that was the unknown. Remember we said we weren't sure about that, but we were going to do it this way until we found some data. Oh, now we have the data. So I'm still right. So I wasn't wrong in suggesting we do it this way as a leader of this change. But things have changed, right? Something's different now. And so I'm going in a different direction. So it's a little bit of like setting yourself up. And obviously you can't do it for everything because there's some things you just won't know at all. But for some things where you go, I don't know, like timelines, for example, right? Rather than, look, in 3 months, this is what's going to happen. If you go, assuming we can do X, Y, and Z, in 3 months, this will happen. If X, Y, and Z take longer, it won't be 3 months, it'll be 4. So now when it's 4, it doesn't feel like, oh gosh, we failed, but it feels like, well, those things played out in a different way than we had anticipated. And so giving yourself a few of those sorts of, not outs, that's the wrong word, but flexibility and building that in from the start helps with those situations, because no one has to admit that they were wrong in that. They just have to admit that circumstances are different.
Appreciate that. I'm conscious of time, and we have a bundle more questions that we could probably spend another 30 minutes on going through all of these things. So we'll try and pick those up and share them with you afterwards, and maybe you can drop a few notes and stuff on that,
Yeah,
responses to go out on that. So Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate this was a great presentation. Lots of positive comments and, considering I think we peaked at, I think I saw 523 people on this webinar at one point in time. So just a few people were kind of interested in this stuff. So that's really good sign, and appreciate the time and effort you put into putting this together for us. So thank you very, very much, Gaurav.
No, thank you. Thanks to everybody for sort of spending the time with us, and thanks for organizing. And yeah, I'd be happy to sort of see what questions we have. And if folks want to, more information, I mean, our website has a ton of resources, and of course, I'm always happy to answer questions if folks reach out directly as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, folks. So we've seen some of the stuff that was in the chat boxes there as well, that you should know that this recording will also be shared with you afterwards, all those that were registered. And we'll also make sure it's available in our resources library. Probably take about a week or so to get it up in the resources library, but it will go up there as well. And of course, remember, if like myself, you're a CCMP, then this is an opportunity to claim a PDU hour to go towards CCMP renewal. So please do make sure that you're updating your CCMP hours. Okay, just after this webinar concludes, there'll be a pop-up that will be asking you for some responses. Please do take a moment. It'll only take a couple of seconds to do that and give us some feedback. Join ACMP's Connect webinar exchange, and I thank you all for the time you've taken and all the contributions. Much appreciated.